This is Dance With Us, a series of podcasts produced and presented by ÄÄFinMalta during the COVID-19 crisis. This program aims to highlight the myriad ways dance features in our lives, reminding us that everyone has a relationship with movement and everyone has an experience of dance. It's also been a great opportunity to draw on the opinions, ideas and perspectives of the many voices in our cultural ecology. We've been talking to dancers and choreographers, as well as artists working in other disciplines, policymakers, curators, writers, directors and thinkers. And today we're speaking to an architect. This week's theme is movement. Movement is the foundation of dance. It's how we locate our bodies in space and an ongoing choreography connecting our everyday life with the world around us. If we break that down even further, body movement or body language is a form of non-verbal communication in which physical behaviours such as facial expressions, posture, gestures, eye movement, touch and the use of space are used to convey information and express feelings. And under the current stay-at-home decree, keeping moving is also becoming a challenge. So we hope these conversations will inspire us to stay connected with our bodies and the spaces we inhabit. So today it's my great pleasure to welcome Konrad Buhagiar to the program. Konrad is one of our country's most respected architects and a founding partner of APValletta. Among his many high-profile projects is the new Valletta City Gate in collaboration with Renzo Piano Building Workshop. Konrad has lectured and published extensively, served on various heritage and restoration boards and committees, and is currently senior visiting lecturer at the University of Malta. Konrad is also a master orator, so I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. So welcome, Konrad.
Hi, good morning.
Konrad, I'm beginning each interview with the same question to set the scene and get everyone in the mood for dance. So if you could tell me, what is your earliest or most vivid memory of dance?
I guess my first memory of dance was not so much about dance, but the social aspect of dance. I was asked to take up the role as page boy at my aunt's wedding. I think I must have been 4. And they dressed me up in tails and a top hat. And I know this because I have a photograph of it.
Yes.
And I remember asking the flower girl, who was my, let's say, partner at the wedding, to dance. And she said no. and she said no. And I remember I said, oh, well, I'll ask your sister to dance then. And I danced with her sister. And I mean, everybody stopped and watched. And I guess, I don't know, I guess in spite of the fact that I'm a tail-end baby boomer, I must have been a millennial at heart. Well, if it's not you, it's your sister. So I danced with her. I don't remember dancing. I don't remember what the dance was. It must have been some kind of a waltz of sorts. But I remember people standing around and watching and saying, oh, look how sweet, the 2 little kids dancing. Then I also remember when I was in London, where my father was studying and I went to school there, the Beatles had just become really, really fashionable. We loved the Beatles. And I remember dancing to She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah.
Oh, perfect. To make up the rejection of your little...
That's what I remember. I think my earliest memory of a public event was the independence celebrations in 1964. And we went to the Independence Arena, Floriana, and I'm sure there was a lot of dancing, but I remember the movements of the soldiers. I remember them throwing themselves on the floor with rifles.
On the floor?
And it was a kind of dance in its own way, because it was all done in sync, you know. Mm-hmm. It was a kind of parade, but it was a show, a military show.
I mean, it's a very tight choreography, the way that military personnel move together, isn't it? It's quite an amazing thing to watch.
Yes, but I guess it's got the discipline that dancers have as well, or at least classical dancers. It's a kind of discipline that I don't really have. I know I'm always out of line, as much as I like dancing. Recently, I took part in a rowing competition with my instructor in Manchester. He's an ex-Marine, and he gave us all our uniforms and caps, and he wanted to take photographs, and he'd say, "Put your left leg out," and I automatically put my right one. But he's like an ex-soldier Marine, and I'm just going against the grain most of the time.
Yeah, perhaps that's a telling aspect of your personality, and one to be proud of, I think. So if we could skip forward now, if you could tell us the tale of what drew you to architecture as a profession, and subsequently the path that brought you to APValletta.
Okay, this is a story I mention quite often. When I was 16, hardly 16, I won a scholarship to go and study French. And since I was so young, no university would accept me except one, which was the University of Besançon in southeast France, Switzerland. And I went there with a group who was made up of other students who were all girls. And when we arrived in Besançon, after having flown to Paris and taken a train down to Besançon, we were separated because the buildings which hosted the boys and the buildings which hosted the girls were separate and opposite sides of the campus. So I found myself alone. It was the first time I was alone, away from my parents. Of course, there were no mobiles at the time. I remember I was very homesick. And one day, it was Sunday, and I knew nobody there. So I was alone a lot, and I walked around the campus. And at one point, I saw a group of African people in national costume walking towards me. And they came up to me and they said, "What are you doing walking alone? It's the national feast of Senegal. Why don't you join us? We're going to a village next to Besançon." And I remember I went there. I boarded the bus with them, and we went to a village. I tasted cider for the first time. There was a speech by the mayor of the village talking about the Senegalese who participated in the resistance. And then on the way back, I saw on the horizon this building, a building which I recognized from my stamp collection. It was a very intriguing building, because having lived all my life in Malta, a building to me was a cubic in shape, but this had an organic shape. It looked like an animal in a way. And they decided to go and visit this building, and it was Ronchamp by Le Corbusier. And we got there, and I remember the sun came out, and there was a priest who took us around and explained the building. And he sat in the niches to show how the niches which kind of articulate the facade were all based on the proportions of the human body. And then inside he stood under the light wells and sang. So he was explaining how the acoustics was, and the light was streaming in through these stained glass windows in these very thick walls. And the atmosphere was so incredible that I was so seduced by it that I wanted to form part of that world. I didn't exactly say I wanted to be an architect, but I said I want to be able to do this, create these incredible spaces.
It's almost the perfect story, isn't it?
And it's so perfect, Nicole, it's so perfect that many years later, 2005, together with my colleagues at the office, we organized a conference which was held in Valletta, called The Founding Myths of Architecture. And it was about all the writings and theories about how architecture came to exist as a discipline or as an art separate from building, and how it is part of the drive of humanity to create spaces for the gods. And one lecturer, who was professor at the Rhode Island School of Design, gave a talk about the trip that Le Corbusier participated in on a boat called the Patrice II in 1931, I think. And they left from Marseille together with other art critics like Gideon, and went to Athens. And on the way, they stopped in Malta, and Le Corbusier drew Gigantea temples. And Gideon, in his diary, describes how fascinated Le Corbusier was by the Maltese temples, and how he based his design of the church of Ronchamp on the Maltese. But it's quite an incredible story. And when he saw, Gideon says that when he saw the temples, Le Corbusier said, he exclaimed, "Oh, the architects of these temples are my brothers across time." Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's kind of the circle turns, no, in a way.
That's wonderful.
Everything is connected.
Yeah. So, so tell me, can you give a summary of your career path in Malta? You know, from that moment, from Le Corbusier's.
So I was 16 when this happened. When I was 17, I started studying architecture. I had a vague idea that it was fascinating for me because I liked the combination of mathematics, which I adored, you know, the rules of the universe and how everything follows kind of an equation, and yet it's so varied. Mm-hmm. And art. And what impressed me most in the start of my, let's say, studies was how in mathematics there was always one solution, which was the right one answer, which was the correct one, and you had to get it right. Whereas in architecture, there are a million ways of designing a handrail, but which one is the right one? And at first, it was a bit of a shock to me, because it was too vast and too difficult to grasp what makes something right and what makes something not right. But life's like that. It's just a multi-layered thing, and you've got to look through all the layers. Unfortunately, sometimes we look at life in a very two-dimensional way. And I don't know, we just look at the economic aspect of something. Does this make money or doesn't it? Simple. And then when you combine...
I was just going to say it became a challenge for you, like a series of puzzles. I mean, design architects often say what we do is solve problems. So, in a sense, that's applying to your story here as well, though.
Yes, there's no one solution, although I really believe that there is one solution. I remember when I was younger, I used to love watching the beauty pageants, Miss Italia. But I used to like it because you see these 100 girls, and you could try and figure out, of all those girls that are parading on the screen, which one's going to win.
Right.
And it's almost scientific. And there are a lot of reasons why. Either because that particular look is fashionable, or because she is, I don't know, the tall blonde girl that the Italian man likes, or because she looks like she could be your sister. A lot of reasons. Mm-hmm. But in the end, and that's what I learned as an architect, that you can narrow it down. And although there are 100 solutions, really there is one which satisfies all the requirements: economic, cultural, social, aesthetic, all of them.
Yeah, within the context of that particular project.
And the struggle is to read through all the layers and to find something which satisfies them all. Because you can make something which is very beautiful, but it's impractical, or something which is really practical, but it's plain. But to find something, and I think that is pure poetry.
So just expanding on that a little, my next question, this week we're discussing bodies and movements. So I wanted to now consider bodies in relation to architecture. With the question, for example, is the building that is not inhabited still architecture? So theories of the body in architecture are not uncommon. Philosophers and theorists have long addressed this issue, that architecture is not simply the materials from which a building is constructed, but rather all of the actions it contains. So the body is the breaths and the movements, so the many layers that you were just referring to. So I'm just wondering, in your career, how you've engaged with this discourse and applied it to your work.
Yeah, as you said, the space is a container for the body and can be enjoyed and perceived and exploited by the person inside the space. So you always consider the body. You have to, because as St. Thomas Aquinas said, the body provides the senses that make us aware of the presence of God. So as opposed to St. Augustine, who considered the flesh to be, well, I'm not a theologian, but I mean, it's a kind of, let's say, problem with Christianity and the Catholic Church, and the idea of flesh as sin, no? And then St. Thomas revolutionized that by saying the body is a sensual machine that allows us to sense through our surroundings and through our senses the presence of God. So the body is what helps us understand space or perceive it or enjoy it. So the space does not exist without a body. There's a French academic called Henri Lefebvre. He wrote a book in English, it's translated The Production of Space. And he makes a distinction between two types of space, the conceived space and the perceived space. Conceived space is what we think that architects do. Conceived space is you conceive a space, it's objective, I can draw it, it's quantifiable, I can make a bill of quantities, and it's completely objective. But then the experience of that space, or what he calls perceived space, is different for everybody. So depending on your memories, your movements within the space, your understanding and your relationship with that space changes. So it kind of connects to what you're saying, how a space changes according to the movement within that space. Architects have always wanted the space to be enjoyed by the person inside the space or by the body. Perhaps the best example is the Renaissance architect who put the human body, who put man at the center of all things, in a way breaking the mold of the sort of mysticism and the obsession with the unknown of the Middle Ages. The Renaissance architect wanted to discover the rules behind things and put man at the center. Obviously, the main symbol of this is Leonardo's man in the circle and the square, no? And they created, the Renaissance architects, especially, let's say the main intellectual of the Renaissance, a guy called Leon Battista Alberti, studied the art of building. In fact, his book, which is the main treatise of the Renaissance on architecture, called the Re Edificatoria, the art of building in relation to the human species, and how building can create a happy society, and how a happy society creates a beautiful building. So it's kind of all connected. As regards movements, then of course different periods have had different relationships with movement. So for example, the Baroque period used drama and movement and created an architecture which was the backdrop for human activity. And then in the modernist period, the great masters of the modernist period like Mies van der Rohe eliminated the symmetry of the classical layout. So the rooms which are in series, like an enfilade of rooms with the door at the center, which guided the visitor on the axis of the building, was completely destroyed by Mies van der Rohe. Yeah. And he dissolved and removed the corners, so people would walk in the space a little bit more randomly and not just on the axis, and people crossed diagonally. So as much as the person who is inside the space has his own perception of the space, the architect can try to condition the way people perceive that space and how they move within that space by the way doors and windows are placed, which then determine the way people move, the way the sun comes in, the way you ventilate the space. So an architect has the ability to mold the space and to create that experience. But then, of course, everybody will have his own experience.
And so when you're designing a space, and I guess, you know, if we think in particular about Malta and the spaces here, the architecture here, I know you're saying that the process of imagining bodies in that space is integral to your process. Are there any particular methodologies you engage to maintain this dialogue with your clients and to realize a project? Very particular to
now, as I said, it's normally an architect has typical classical tools for representing space. In the past, it used to be breaking down the space into plans, sections, and elevations. That's the way I grew up. And of course, with the advent of computer technology, it became almost a mainstream way of representing spaces through 3D constructions, and then the ability to move around that space, so almost getting one step closer to simulating the feeling of that space by being inside it. So yes, with clients, there are all these techniques for representing space, which is a virtual space. As I said, in the past, it used to be broken down into plans, sections, and elevations. And today it's 3D renderings, which gives the client a better understanding of the space. But in a way, I find, having, let's say, spanned both periods, you know, the pre and the post-computer, the pre and post-computer technology, and it removes a little bit of the mystery. In the past, an architect would come to you, a client would come to us and say, you know what, you're the architect, I leave it in your hands, I trust you.
Right.
The ability of the computer to represent space more accurately gives the client a feeling that he is more in control. And therefore, let's say, I'm saying this in a good way, the interference of the client is greater, let's say.
And do you find that clients are they more preoccupied with the way they will inhabit that space as bodies, how they'll move in the space, or do they get more caught up in aesthetics, or is it not one or the other?
the interesting thing about a building is that, as I was saying, in spite of the advent of computer technologies, you never get the sensation of that space as when you are inside that space. And therefore, it requires quite a bit of projection, which an architect is trained to do. So very often, a client tells us once the building is up, "Oh, this is what you meant. Now I understand you," when they're actually in the space. So there has to be a little bit of, actually a great amount of faith in the architect on the client side. And very often, really good buildings are quite simple and abstract on drawing. And very often I see projects where the form of the building or the materiality of the building is clearly just an extension of the lines on a drawing. In other words, the lines were drawn and the building was based on that, rather than the building is conceived as a building and then the lines are there to represent. I look down, for example, on the project of the garden in the ditch from City Gate, and I see those planters and benches and different materials, etc. What I see is a drawing. Somebody drew that and then justified those lines by creating what's in the ditch, rather than imagining the ditch and drawing lines on the paper to represent that imagined space. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And in fact, I was going to ask you how your methodologies differ, or how clients consider bodies and movement, whether they're very different between public and private space. But maybe you've just tapped into that a little by mentioning this part.
Well, as an office, we're very interested in. We divide. It's a kind of bit of a modernist concept. We divide space into private and public, which is the case. On the other hand, private and public are interwoven, and we're quite interested, even if we're doing a private space, with its relationship with the rest of the city and the public space. So a lot of our projects are, in fact, spatially connected to the city. In fact, that's why at one point we changed our name from AP to APValletta, because Valletta is what informs what we do, and is a protagonist in our firm as much as we are. So if we did a bridge for Marks and Spencer to be able to cross from the premises on Palace Square onto the building in Straight Street, what we're doing is crossing public space with a private space, if you know what I mean. Yeah. When Renzo Piano placed this building on columns, the idea was that you could see through and see right up to Castile Square. There was, when we were building the project, was a lot of discussion about the Opera House. And the truth is that what Renzo Piano wanted to do was to create a balance between the solid of the Parliament building and the transparency almost of the ruins of the Opera House. So as you're walking down Republic Street, you can look straight up towards Castile Square. And you understand today that the project is finished, how that whole area is connected with the two Baroque churches and then Castile. Whereas if the theatre was a compact, opaque building, a traditional theatre with steps and a pediment and closed building, that area behind would have been completely cut off. He also split the building into two, with the chamber on one side and the offices of the Speaker of the House and the opposition and members of Parliament on the other side. So when you look through, you see the Cavalier. So all at one go, you see the stratification of contemporary, but then the 16th century Cavalier, the 19th century ruins of the temple, of the theatre, the 18th century churches and the 18th century Castile. So you have this condensation, almost like a perfume, no? Of city, of city life.
I was going to say, I mean, the nature of Valletta really demands that as well, doesn't it? It's so compact. There really is very little delineation.
Valletta was created as an ideal city. It's a typical Italian city based on the principles of humanism. In fact, I always say in my lectures, I show what Leon Battista Alberti wrote for small fortified towns, and then I take a report of Laparelli, which he presented to the Council of the Order when he was presenting his plans to the Grand Master. And it's almost a cut and paste of what Leon Battista Alberti said 100 years earlier. Mm-hmm. And the city was there built for to provide space for a harmonious society. In fact, he says, I will build for reasons of beauty and harmony, only one wide street running down the middle, which is kind of Republic Street.
Republic.
Of course. And when you look on Republic Street, especially now that the streets are empty because we're all in quarantine, you look at it and it looks exactly like one of these ideal towns depicted in the Quattrocento by Italian artists. And talking about the body, there were a number of 15th century architects. I think the most famous one was a guy called Francesco di Giorgio Martini, who based urban planning on the human body, and he designed a series of fortified towns which are superimposed over the proportions of the human body.
Wow.
And there was a kind of trend at the time, not to say obsession, about anthropomorphism, which is how beauty and harmony stems from an imitation of the proportions of the human body. So even classical, the Renaissance architects went down to Rome from Florence, like Brunelleschi, for example, and studied classical ruins and tried to understand what the proportions of those remains were, of those columns, and came up with lots of theories about, there are some beautiful treatises, Filarete, all these theorists of the Renaissance. But at the center of all their researches was the human body, and how the human body can provide you with the secret for perfect harmony.
Wow. So if I could now just steer us, that just creates a nice segue. Speaking more about the body and movement, this could be a very long bow, this next question I want to ask you, but just to give some background. So the universal definition of dance is movement in response to rhythm, and most often music. But for me, dance, music and movement happen to be synonymous with architects. I happen to have many friends who are architects and architecture academics, and I've danced countless hours with all of them. It's kind of the nexus of these very deep friendships that I have with these people. And many of them also double as DJs. And I've often asked myself this question and never really fully had the conversation with an architect. Is it drawing a long bow to ask, is this a coincidence or is there something in it? Is there a connection between why do architects love dancing and music and DJing? Do you see anything there?
Well, there certainly is a connection, because all these disciplines that you mentioned, whether it's dance, music, architecture, are based on internal structures which tie things together, like proportion, for example, harmony. So as much as it's a tangible, sensual thing that you can hear and enjoy, touch and enjoy, see and enjoy, there are abstract rules which holds the whole thing together and make it beautiful. And whether it's music or it's architecture, it's the same thing. And it comes back to what I was saying before, mathematics and the rules of the universe. And that's what combines, it's almost like these disciplines connect us to the bigger picture, to the rules of the universe. What gives validity to who we are within this giant network where, again, everything is connected.
Mm.
It's a form of unveiling of those connections.
So it can apply really to many things, but in this case, we're talking about the structure of the music composition, the lyrics, the...
Yes, composition, for example, which was the main item of a classical education for any artist. Unfortunately, today, I don't think composition is high on the priority list of an architect's curriculum.
Mm.
But from time immemorial up till the modern movement, composition was the main form of education of an architect. Then the modern movement created an idea of form follows function,
Mm-hmm.
and that the function is more important than the actual proportion, but that the form will eventually represent how the building works.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that's a long story. It's about organic architecture and all this, but I won't go there. But yes, it is about composition. And both music and architecture have that in common, that it looks at harmony through mathematics. And what is mathematics? It's the most abstract thing, but at the same time, when you do get a grasp of it, it's so real and so present. It orders the way your brain works. Exercising mathematics puts order in your mind. And I think that's part of the mystery of the universe, which is so chaotic, and yet our minds are able to recognize an order within it.
Mm-hmm.
And that order that we recognize leads us to something which is greater. And I guess that creates a spiritual view of the universe and creates the idea that God exists.
And we're back to God again. I mean, I know that you love to dance and love music, and you're one of those artists who I'm referring to. But as a spectator, when you're watching a dance performance, I'm just curious, how do you watch it? Are you observing through the lens of your profession somehow? And so what does
Talking about God, so Blake represented God as an architect, no? He's got a divider. You know that famous engraving by Blake?
say that
It's God with his long beard, and he's sort of crouching, and he's holding a divider. Anyway, I don't know what year it is, 1700 something, I guess. Anyway, I like to see things from above, yes. And I think if I had to watch a dance, I try to put myself in the mind of the choreographer.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm trying to see what the underlying principle behind the dance is, and what ties it together.
Mm-hmm.
And that is, in a way, what a choreographer does. And in this particular moment, he's the God, no? He's the God who's deciding how things happen.
Well, it is, and it is also a composition, as we were discussing.
Yes, it is a composition. Yes, it is a composition.
Yeah.
It is a composition of bodies and forms and lines, really important, again, like in architecture. And that's why I like contemporary dance a lot, because contemporary dance also exploits different spaces. It isn't just a classical dance on a stage with a proscenium, where the vision of the spectators solely and constantly frontal, and therefore contemporary dance can produce much more innovative movements, because it also uses much more unorthodox spaces.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I was just thinking back to your earlier comment where I kind of cut you off, where the choreographer is God. I'm sure there are many choreographers who would love to hear that. I think that there was something in the 90s, God is a big, I think there's a line from some song. God is a choreographer. It's almost the perfect note to end.
Yes.
And we can conclude there. Is there, just in terms of what we were just discussing about how you view a performance, I know you've seen a few ÄŽfinMalta performances.
Yes.
Are there any particular references there in terms of?
Well, the recent one I saw, there was, I think it was called 12 or Nash. It was a show where I think there may have been 12 dancers throwing bottles of water to each other, if not at each other.
It's a very athletic work.
It was very athletic. But what fascinated me about that is that the lines which are normally expressed through the body were created by the trajectory of the bottles. Mm-hmm. So it was inside the square space of the old University Theatre, which used to be called MITP. I don't know what it's called today. And it sort of expressed the geometry of that space through the way these bottles were being thrown from one dancer to the other, who were arranged in a particular geometric shape. Mm-hmm. So it was either a square, a triangle, I can't remember, but then it was, these bottles were crossing in the air. So the dance was not only the bodies of the dancer and their movement as well, because when you throw a bottle, it's like when you're throwing a ball, no, your arm goes back and then it goes forward, but the bottle continues the line of the hand and then joins the other hand that catches it.
And in fact, the dancers are creating their own kind of choreography in the actual performance of that work. We also have a podcast with the choreographer of that work, Corbusier, which is...
Mm-hmm. And then it had another element which we didn't talk about, but which fascinates me a lot, the element of risk, which architects unconsciously are dealing with every day. Mm-hmm. Because when you start a project, you're starting and you know that in the coming 3 years minimum, lots of things are going to happen, but you don't know what is going to be. And if you wanted to know what is going to be, because you want the comfort of security and stability, then you might as well not be an architect.
No, definitely. It's...
And Leon Battista Alberti designed his own logo, which is an eye with a wing, which is embossed on a medallion, which is in a museum somewhere in Italy. And his slogan was "Quid tum?" What next? Mm-hmm. So architecture is about the future, and you don't know what the future is.
No. There could be a pandemic that comes along and...
Yes, and changes the way you live, no? Yeah.
Yeah, there's no instant gratification in architecture, is there?
Not at all. In fact, it's one of the things that I tell all young architects, it's like instant gratification is not on the cards when it comes to building something. Your best and most beautiful project will take you 10 years. And a decade will pass and your way of looking at life will have completely changed by the time it's finished.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary.
But then also, time is really interesting. Time is very interesting.
It's another conversation.
It's another conversation.
I want to thank you so much, Konrad, for speaking today. I know we could talk for a very long time about time and movement, I mean, you're used to that, as you've just pointed. You know that we've got 10 years to finish this podcast. We actually don't. So thank you very, very much. It's always
Thank you.
to talk to you and